Thank you, Professor, for joining me on this podcast of mine. To introduce myself, my name is Karthik. I'm a geopolitical enthusiast, and most recently, I watched a lot of your videos on YouTube,
I'm flattered, thank you.
and that inspired me to get in touch with you, and that's how we got in touch, and we met a couple of times. And to also introduce you as well, I don't think particularly you need an introduction, but people know you very well in at least
In a very narrow circle, I'm very well known.
correct. So you're an associate professor at the University of Sydney,
That's correct.
and
Yeah.
you particularly specialize in democracy and a few other things.
Well, by specialty, I'm a comparative sociologist. The current project I've been working on is on democracy and authoritarianism. But before that, there was a different project, and after that, there will be a new project. So my specialty is comparative analysis, not so much any particular area of study.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Thank you again for the introduction. But let me quickly start by asking you what got you interested in India and democracy in India, if you could elaborate on that.
Sure, it's precisely that fact that by comparative standards, India is an extraordinary democracy. It shouldn't be a democracy. Both our qualitative and our quantitative studies of democracies have all concluded that India either should not be a democracy or would not last long as a democracy, or is now that India has lasted 70 years is an extreme outlier as a democracy. It's simply the fact that India does not resemble the profile of other countries that have had 75 years of, well, 76 years now of regular elections with routine turnover of parties in power, with no serious violence around elections, no coups d'etat, nothing, right? You can't find another country with the track record of India's democracy for less than about $30,000 a year GDP per capita, give or take a little. You can't even find a country, if we take 1975 to 77 as a crisis period and we're not willing to give that to India, and so if instead we say, you know, India has maybe 45 years of democracy, still you can't find another country with a GDP per capita under $20,000 a year that has even 3 decades of democracy, never mind 4, 5, 6, 7 decades of democracy. It's a truly exceptional case, and that's what's led me to being willing to spend at least 5 years of my life so far studying Indian democracy.
Okay, that's a fair observation. Let me pivot a little bit and ask you how would you compare the likes of India? India is an extremely complex country, like you mentioned. The fact that we managed to be a democracy for a very long time is A, surprising, and B, at the same time worthy of giving a recognition to it. How would you compare us to the likes of our neighbors? For example, Pakistan. They call themselves a democracy, but are they truly a democracy? If you could elaborate a bit on that.
A lot of people think that India's democracy owes its robustness and longevity to its heritage of British institutions. And right off the bat, we can say that's obviously false. And we can say that just by looking at other countries in South Asia that have had similar objective circumstances that also have a heritage of British institutions. So obviously people look first to Pakistan. Pakistan has a troubled history of military involvement in politics, military calling the shots, of times where there are elections in Pakistan, but then political assassinations, suspensions of elections, returns to elections. You're never actually sure to what extent Pakistan is a democracy or whether the next elections will be held. And that includes this year, where there are elections, but Imran Khan has been imprisoned, and there are all sorts of problems with Pakistan's democracy. Looking beyond that, let's look at Bangladesh. Bangladesh just had an election in January, but Sheikh Hasina has imprisoned most of her opposition. The remaining opposition leaders refused to participate in the election. It's essentially a one-party democracy. It's probably on a par in some way with Russia in terms of the quality of its democracy. It still has elections, but those are not serious competitive elections with freedom to contest from multiple parties. Or let's look at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has a slightly better history, but even in Sri Lanka, its history is blighted by civil war and very brutal civil war, by the extreme corruption of the Rajapaksa regime, by the irregular downfall of the Rajapaksa regime. Now everybody's hoping that it will be a stable democracy from here on out. I don't have to mention Myanmar. Everyone knows that Myanmar has been under military dictatorship for most of its history. So this is the former British India.
Yep.
These four countries. What kind of democracy do they have compared to India? So I think it really becomes obvious that India's democracy must be homegrown, because the institutions bequeathed by Britain to South Asia have gone nowhere in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Myanmar. They've gone everywhere in India.
It's extremely an interesting observation. I personally didn't know that myself about Bangladesh. I did know that India helped Bangladesh gain independence through multiple military support and many other forms. But the
Bangladesh government right now is very friendly to India, so it enjoys the support of the Indian government. But it's not a democracy. I mean, Saudi Arabia enjoys the support of the U.S. government. It doesn't make it a democracy.
Absolutely.
Bangladesh is has only the outer forms of democracy with no actual competition under Sheikh Hasina, and it's simply not a comparable country. Even though economically, it has almost exactly the same GDP per capita as India.
Very interesting. So what I would like to do is, I've gained a ton of knowledge knowing about what Bangladesh is, what Pakistan is as a democracy or not. Certainly, with my age and experience, I can no way compare them to democracy in India, like you rightly pointed out. But Bangladesh seems to be growing economically pretty well, particularly in certain sectors such as textile, etc. Yeah. That's beyond this podcast, but they seem to be doing much better than our neighbors in Pakistan. What's your thoughts on that? Is it because of economic reforms, or is it because leadership? What's that's driving it?
Since 1971, Bangladesh has done much better than Pakistan. It was severely repressed under East Pakistan, under West Pakistan rule, under Punjabi rule, essentially. And since 1971, Bangladesh has flourished. It's done much better than their cousins in the Punjab and Sindh. That said, Bangladesh is still a poor country, obviously. It's slightly poorer than India. For one brief moment, it was slightly higher than India in GDP per capita, but that was a result of COVID closures, and that was a momentary spot in time. It wasn't something lasting. Bangladesh has done reasonably well on a low-cost, export-driven economy, and a lot of people advocate that for India, that India should copy Bangladesh and adopting a low-cost export model. I remind people that India, despite being much larger than Bangladesh, actually has a higher percentage of exports out of GDP, which is to say India is much more an export-driven economy than Bangladesh is. The reason nobody seems to realize that is Bangladesh's exports go to the West. So we have lots of shirts that have a label that says made in Bangladesh. India's exports mainly go to the Middle East and Southeast Asia, with the result that Westerners are not aware that India is an export-driven economy. Those exports are things like refined petroleum products, like cut diamonds, other value-added goods, as opposed to very basic commodities like what Bangladesh exports. Bangladesh has done better than Pakistan, and I think that's probably because of long-term structural factors. A lot of people like to attribute these things to government policies. Personally, I'm very much a structuralist in my perspective. I think that over long periods of time, structural forces far outweigh any particular government policies. In Bangladesh, what we saw is a country carved out of the hinterland of the old Bengal. That is, the old Bengal was centered in Calcutta, with Dhaka and the rest of East Bengal being relatively poor areas that fed into the cosmopolitan economy of Calcutta. Well, once they were divorced from India, they bounced up in the sense of they were no longer being exploited by Calcutta. They became their own economy.
Yeah.
Change over to Pakistan, and you have the opposite effect. Pakistan is in many ways the richer side. That is, Lahore is now in Pakistan, Karachi is now in Pakistan, and the hinterland of Lahore and Karachi are now in places like India's Punjab and Gujarat and Kashmir.
Yep.
Right. So the hinterland, which used to feed into Lahore and make Lahore rich, has been separated from it. With the result that Gujarat and Punjab, initially after independence, did extremely well in India, whereas Sindh and Pakistani Punjab stagnated.
Yeah.
Now that's a structuralist approach to economic growth. I can't prove it's right, but that's the lens through which I see the differential performance of Bangladesh and Pakistan.
Okay, they're great observations. And let's get back into, since you mentioned elections, that gets back into the election mode. You see elections going to happen globally, particularly in India and the United States in 2024. How would the results of these two elections in these two countries impact global economy and anything associated, directly or indirectly associated with global economy? If you could elaborate and throw your 2 cents, that'll be great.
The Indian election will have no effect on the global economy because, and I'm sorry, a lot of people don't like to hear this, India's economy will not change dramatically no matter who's in charge. The way forward for India is obvious. All parties are going to follow that route forward. You could argue that your preferred party may do it more efficiently than the other preferred party, but fundamentally, India's growth trajectory is baked in for the next 12 or 15 years.
Okay.
The U.S. elections are likely to be much more consequential, but it's hard to tell in what way. That is, we all know that a Trump presidency would be very different in its international engagement from a Biden presidency. And we might suspect that I'm going to put this in scare quotes, a Biden 2 presidency, or whoever succeeds Biden, because I think very few people think, I think even very few Biden supporters believe that Joe Biden will be the president 5 years from now. Right? So whatever the Biden 2 administration is, whether it's led by Joe Biden, led by somebody else, whether Biden steps down from the campaign and so on, will probably be very different from the Biden presidency, because the Biden presidency has been a kind of stopgap. It's been a kind of, we're not Trump, as opposed to setting out a positive agenda. Most people are unaware, but if you look at Biden's actual economic agenda, almost all of Donald Trump's major policies have been kept in place. Economic policies. Right. I'm not talking the border, but the economic policies, the tariffs on China, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the coercive use of tariffs to get trade preference, all that stayed in place under Biden. Would that change? I think that these policies are likely to be revisited no matter who wins in 2024 and takes office in 2025. I can't give you a prediction as to what they will be. All I can tell you is that it will change. And in what way it will change, it's a big wild card.
Absolutely fair enough on that. Definitely nobody could predict elections unless you, in our world we call it, unless you have the purchase order, you don't have a deal.
I'm willing to predict the elections. I'm just not willing to predict the policies that will result from the elections.
Yeah, fair observation. But let me delve a little bit, double click into Biden's administration.
Sure.
And potential Trump comeback and a few other things about the US politics and economy. Many people see the Biden administration to be extremely weak, spineless, and very reactive. Would you agree to that? Or is it, sure, he followed a lot of Trump's policies, he didn't make a significant contribution to the economy since he took over as a president?
I wouldn't say, I would say weak. I would not say spineless. I would say directionless, in that it's very clear that Joe Biden is not giving strong executive direction to a unified administration policy on just about anything. Instead, the administration is a series of fiefdoms with each of these barons in their own fief running their own policies, often at odds with each other. And that's why you see, for example, on the border issue, you see the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, Mayorkas, essentially running an open borders policy, while New York and Chicago Democratic Party grandees are flying to Washington to protest. Right? There's no consensus. There's no single unifying policy framework around the Biden administration's approaches to the border, to economic development, to international relations. Instead, each pillar of the administration is running its own policies. That's not necessarily bad. We all think saying a leadership is strong is a compliment of some kind. Many political scientists would argue that no, it's much better to have decentralized expert analysis or expert policymaking in each area. I personally would rather see a strong policy direction from a leader, but that's a personal preference that I recognize I don't have the data to prove that that's actually a better approach to policy. After all, a strong leader with a strong vision can take the country off a cliff. So is strong and clear better? Well, we can argue these things.
Yeah, sure. How much of this time frame Biden has been in power has got people thinking, oh, I definitely think Trump was a better leader, want to bring him back?
That's a trend in U.S. polling. So the polling is showing that immediately after the changeover in the presidency in January 2024, that most Americans thought it was time for a change, and that the chaos of what they perceived, at least, the chaos of the Trump administration was better left behind. There was this narrative of the adults are in the room. And then we saw how the adults promptly, maxed out their credit cards, burnt down their house, didn't do their homework, whatever. So we've seen the adults make a disaster of things. That really started with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think everybody reasonable, I would almost say just everybody, except people directly involved, agree that the American withdrawal from Afghanistan was disastrous. It simply was not well executed. And I think from that symbolic point, the Biden administration has never recovered any reputation for efficiency. The border crisis only reinforces that sense that it has no ability to, no control over events, with the effect that Americans are more and more looking back to, pre-2020 Trumpian golden age of low unemployment, low inflation, strong economic growth, strong stock markets, no international wars, no terror attacks. Whether or not Trump could be credited for those things, you can say it's all Trump's doing. You could say, no, Barack Obama set him up for a fantastic run. Again, we can legitimately argue these questions, but the simple fact is that the pre-COVID Trump administration presided over an America that seemed in control, whereas the Biden administration seems not to be in control. And so many Americans, not the majority, I want to be clear, as always in American politics, that shift of 5 or 10% in the middle is completely decisive. So a small number of people who, in January 2021 were ready for a change, maybe 10% of them are now in January 2024 upset they made the change. It's not everybody. We shouldn't exaggerate, but it's enough to change. It's enough to tilt an election.
Okay, so just double clicking on that again as well. Many people argue that if Trump was president for the second term, the war in Ukraine versus Russia would never have happened.
No, many people don't argue that. Donald Trump argues that. now, nobody knows. Nobody knows. It's an unknowable.
Okay.
It's a fundamentally unknowable proposition.
Fair enough. We've gone around the world, but let's come back to India. And today, as we record this podcast, we have the inauguration of the Ram Temple in Ayodhya. Personally, I do come from a Hindu background, but I'm not extremely religious. I follow certain things, I don't follow certain things. I'm okay with things happening or not happening.
You should embrace vegetarianism like I do.
I am I am vegetarian. I'm trying to embrace being vegan. So let's put it that way. It's hard trying to be vegan. So yeah, I'd like to get your thoughts on, whilst India is a great democracy, we have multiple plural religions living there, and people can argue about discrimination and whatnot, but in my view, everybody gets equal rights if you're in the right place, right time. About the Ram Temple, I want to sort of delve into it because the current ruling party, BJP, thinks that it's one of its greatest achievements, and that's going to drive a lot of outcome for the 2024 elections as well. So it's probably linked.
That I disagree with, but that the BJP strongly identifies with the Ram Temple. Yes, absolutely. I mean, for the last 70 years. But that it will have a big effect on the 2024 election, I'm very skeptical.
Okay, fair enough. But I don't know. I don't know much about the Ram Temple myself. Some people say that it's the Supreme Court's verdict. There was a temple earlier, got demolished. There was a mosque for many years, and now they proved it. Using artifacts, architecturally, they've proved it did exist, and reconstructed the temple again. But does this have any impact on common Indians or Indian people?
First, I want to say the archaeology is irrelevant. I know it's very important to many Hindus to prove that the site was a Hindu site dating back thousands of years. From a political standpoint, that's irrelevant.
Right.
Politically, all that matters is that upwards of 1 billion people want to see a Ram Temple there.
Okay.
Right. I might contrast this. For example, Israel, after it occupied Jerusalem, allowed the Al-Aqsa Mosque to stand. Now, the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built on the site of the former Jewish temple, right? They could have just torn down the mosque and built a new temple. Why didn't they? Yeah, because upwards of 1 billion Muslims believe that that Muhammad ascended to heaven from that spot. Okay. And so it's very important. Did Muhammad ascend to heaven from the Temple Mount? I have no idea. I wasn't there. But 1 billion people believe it, and so that mosque has been allowed to stand, despite how strongly so many Israelis feel about the Temple Mount. Reverse that around in Ayodhya. In Ayodhya, 1 billion Hindus, give or take, I don't know, everyone accepts it, believe that this is the birthplace of Lord Ram. Was it the birthplace of Lord Ram?
We don't know.
I don't know. No one's ever going to prove that. And I put it to believers, what if you did the archaeology and found no signs of a former temple? Would you still want the site? Absolutely. Right. So in that case, then the archaeology doesn't matter. The truth doesn't matter in some sense, because we can never know the truth. The important thing is that so many people believe it's so holy, while on the Muslim side of this question, let's face it, this was just a neighborhood mosque. Right? This wasn't one of the great mosques of Islam. It wasn't a pilgrimage site. It wasn't a place where hundreds of thousands of devotees went to pay respects to Babur. It was just a local mosque. Okay. What should have happened was that there should have been some kind of civil agreement between Hindu organizations and Muslim organizations to purchase the land, respectfully remove the mosque or relocate the mosque, and build it elsewhere. Unfortunately, what happened, of course, was 1992 and the mob destruction of the mosque. And whatever people may say about, well, the land was truly Hindu, etc., in a society under rule of law, we don't allow mobs to tear down buildings, no matter how passionately they may feel about it. Why? Because we don't want another mob coming to our buildings and feeling passionate. Even beyond that, it's not just tit for tat. It's just not what we do in a civilized society. Now, that demolition, of course, was followed by 3 months of violence focused in Mumbai. Upwards of 2,000 people lost their lives in that violence. That's something that people should reflect on and really take very seriously. That said, that was 3 decades ago. Since then, the site has been under civil administration. Since then, the Supreme Court case has finally run its course. Since then, under rule of law, the temple site was allocated to the Hindu community. Since then, the Supreme Court ordered that the temple could be built. I think we should all respect that decision. Nobody is going to accuse the Indian Supreme Court of being in the palm of the BJP. Okay, no one's going to accuse the Indian Supreme Court of majoritarianism.
Yeah.
The Indian Supreme Court made a legal decision. I'm not an Indian lawyer. I can't tell you whether that decision was correct or not. All I can tell you was, in democratic societies under rule of law, we accept the decision of the Supreme Court. And so the temple's being built. Many people are very happy about it.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, I'm sure, are upset about it. But that's how things go in a society under rule of law. We don't all get our way. We arrive at reasonable answers to difficult problems, and we move on from there.
Perfect. I was told that there was an alternative site proposed for the mosque,
Yes.
and they have provided one as well. One could argue that, again, it's for argument's sake. One could argue that, look, if it happened to a Hindu place or a Muslim place over this one, they come over, demolish our temples and walk over. Nobody has any questions. They don't go down the path of law, but we followed the path of law. We went to Supreme Court, irrespective of what happened 3
Look,
decades
rule
ago.
of law was established in India on August 15th, 1947.
Mm-hmm.
Before that, there was no rule of law in India. There was arbitrary rule. Okay, under rule of law for ordinary matters, but nonetheless, the British reserved to themselves the right to turn off rule of law whenever they felt it was necessary. India has been under rule of law now for 76 years. Was India under rule of law in the time of Babur and the time of Aurangzeb? No, it was not.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't think we get anywhere in society by saying that these people's ancestors or antecedents did something terrible 800 years ago, and so it's okay if I do something illegal to
Absolutely
them
not,
today.
yeah.
That's not how we run a society. The important thing is that Supreme Court made a decision. Now, my own preference and my advice to Indian Hindus and Muslims is that they do not resort to the courts to solve their future disputes, that the disputes in Varanasi over the Vishwanath temple, that the dispute in Mathura, that these be handled directly by civil society, that civil society leaders come together and come to a reasonable solution. So if Muslims say that it is illegal to deconsecrate a mosque, that's one argument. Some Muslims believe that once a mosque, always a mosque, it can't be deconsecrated. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not exactly true everywhere. We've seen that in Turkey, mosques have been deconsecrated and reconsecrated. The Hagia Sophia, most famously, was deconsecrated by Ataturk and then reconsecrated. So we know that not all Muslims believe that. But if enough Muslims believe that, could there be a solution? We have modern engineering. You've seen how houses can be literally moved. Could the mosque literally be lifted from its foundation, moved 100 meters, mm-hmm. and the site be given to a Hindu temple, which pays for the move, compensates, for the property? Now, I don't know why Muslim and Hindu civil society leaders in India are not having these conversations. If they're having them, they're not having them publicly. They're not talking about them. But it's better if government wasn't involved at all. It's better if both communities said, we truly believe this, please respect our true beliefs. And we know that 98% of Indians, from survey data, 98% of Indians respect other people's religions. Well, if that's the case, then these problems should be solvable.
Absolutely. Look, I want to touch upon those points that you just mentioned with the limited knowledge that I have. Look, India is a society where temples are controlled by the state.
Well, not all temples, but
some temples are controlled by the
many
state.
Temples.
Yeah, majority of the revenue generated from those temples goes to the state's pocket.
Depending on what state in India and the local situation. Yeah.
That's right. At the same time, we have something called WAQF board in India, which has almost they're the third largest landowner in India. So they control many of the lands which are not even mosques or whatever you want to call it. So it's a complicated society where there's no one law for everybody. There's different laws for different people. You know what I mean? So that becomes extremely challenging to control a lot of things from a egalitarian perspective.
Look, I'll say this straight to camera. State management of temples is stupid.
Yeah.
It's just stupid.
Yeah.
It's a survival of an earlier era that exists because state governments don't want to give up the revenue. Let's just be honest. It's revenue, it's patronage, it's who gets to appoint the priest at the temple, it's opportunities for corruption. The state should get out of the business of running temples. I don't know all the local temple laws in India.
Yeah.
State shouldn't be involved in running temples or mosques or any other religious institutions.
Okay. That's a fair conclusion, I think. But also, you've spoken about this in the past many times about the Westerners' view about India, and the purview is that a lot of people are talking bad things about India, and potentially newspapers like New York Times and many other people, there could be potentially people who migrated from India, could be trash talking about India. So how does India get out of that image? You've on multiple channels suggested some ways and means how to mend it, and you met the Prime Minister Modi and gave him tips about this. How could we do this in a more aggressive, much more fast-paced way? What's your view on that?
Western institutions learn about India from Indians. That's a serious problem because the character of Indians who get involved with those institutions is highly biased. The sort of Indian who becomes a political scientist at a Western university is not representative of India as a whole. The same way that the sort of Australian who becomes a political scientist at an Australian university is not representative of Australia as a whole. In general, people who enter the social sciences and humanities are highly critical of their societies, Often, they have these glowing, fantastical views of other societies. So if you consider China studies in the US or Australia, China studies is dominated not by Chinese Australians or Chinese Americans. It's dominated by Americans and Australians who love China. They love China so much, they learn Chinese, they study China, dedicated their lives to the study of China, and they present a largely positive view of China because, after all, it's a love affair for them. They're studying China because they love China. Indonesian studies in Australia is not done by Indonesian Australians, it's done by white Australians who fell in love with Indonesia on a trip to Indonesia, and thus. And so even if they don't present a positive view of China, they present a much more positive view than the reality.
Okay.
Right? They're way better than the reality. On the other hand, Australians who study Australia are fringe. I mean, they're to the left of the Green Party. They're fringe critical of Australia. Australia is a racist, genocidal country that engages in modern slavery. I mean, the stuff you see coming out of Australian political science and sociology and anthropology is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, in the same way, because Indian studies in the West is mainly the preserve of Indian emigres, they are just as critical of their I put in quotes because most of them have become US citizens or Australian citizens, but their country of origin, they're just as critical of that as American sociologists are of America or as Australian sociologists are of Australia. And that creates a real problem. There are very few Westerners who study Indian society. There are only probably one hand's worth of Western research academics who study India, and even they are, for the most part, people who are not so much in love with India, but who have an axe to grind about India. You have a passion about something. Either they're Islamist scholars. Now, they're not Muslim.
Yeah.
I want to be clear, this is not about Muslims. This is about Western Islamic studies people who thus view Hindu-majority India as an enemy of some kind, or they come out of Christian missionary backgrounds, and they view Hindu-dominated India as a enemy of some kind. The number of people, actually, I don't know of a single person, if you'll forgive my saying, I don't like to be self-referential, I don't know of a single person like me, Western person, who simply came to the study of India as an interesting empirical problem. without having any personal stake in the issue. And that's a problem for India. It means that all of our Western discourse on India is dominated by people who either are Indian emigres who have an axe to grind in Indian politics, or are Western South Asian studies specialists who have an axe to grind in Indian politics.
Yeah.
It's a real problem for India. There's no easy solution to it. It can only be fought with data and with more information.
Yep. I'm sure data and analytics could do some good to us in this space. But having said that...
it's not the analytics. We need the data.
Yeah.
So I've talked to lots of computer scientists who want to do, machine learning studies. And it's like, no, the problem isn't the lack of analytical firepower.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is we just don't have the data. For example, the one study we have of status of religion in India was conducted in 2019 by the Pew Research Center. It's an excellent study. Pew Research Center did it because they thought they were going to find all these terrible things about religion in India, and they found that actually people generally respect each other, and people don't feel discriminated against, and people feel like, and this is true not just of Hindus, but of Muslims, of Sikhs, of Jains, of Christians, all for the most part feeling that in India religion is respected and they face very little discrimination. Now, Pew did not want that result. The Templeton Foundation, which funded the study, is closely linked to Christian missionary groups. The Templeton Foundation funded the study, I'm convinced, for the purpose of getting data to support their anti-India narratives. Well, they're never going to run the study again.
Yeah.
If I could tell Mr. Modi how to spend $10 million, I would say, no, $2 million I think the study costs. I would say, run that study every 3 years. Because you will, if you fund it, run it every 3 years, you'll get a track record of good news about freedom of religion in India. Now, of course, you might find something you don't want. You have to be adult enough that if discrimination ticks up, instead of saying, this study was badly conducted, which is the knee-jerk response, let's face it, of the Indian government today, they should say, oh, discrimination ticked up, we need to work on that. So if they can be adult enough to use the data in an adult way to improve the country, they should be running this study every 3 years. And similarly with other studies on freedom of the press in India, studies on the deaths among journalists in India. And so, for example, there's only one study of freedom of press in India. It's done by Reporters Sans Frontières. Their respondents to their study are unnamed. Of course, they wouldn't name them because then they would face possible pressures and danger. But we don't even know what organizations they work for. They might be working all for The Wire, and News Laundry and whatever. Okay, so we could have the Indian government or a foundation, an Indian foundation, could fund a study that every year asks all journalists at major news organizations, they could say newspapers with a circulation greater than 100,000.
Yeah.
And television news with a viewership greater than 1 million. And interview those journalists about freedom. I bet they would get very different results. But someone has to pay for that study.
Yeah.
Until someone pays for that study, we're all reliant on whatever Reporters Sans Frontières wants to do because they're the only data available. So the problem is not the lack of analytics. The problem is the lack of the underlying data to analyze.
Okay, fair enough. In essence, what you're saying is all this bad image that about India, of the West having a bad image about India, is self-inflicted pain by India. And also, you touched upon many points there. It's fascinating to know all of those things at the same time. It's just that it seems like it's self-inflicted pain and the government has to do something about it by investing in studies such as women's dementia.
And I don't want to disparage it so much. Look, the fact that academics want reform for their country and want their country to be better is not in itself a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right? It's something admirable. That Australian sociologists and political scientists want social justice for Aboriginal people, want public acceptance for sexual minorities, that they want to address the pay gap between men and women, that they want to do these things. That's a good thing for society. The problem is that it gives us a highly biased view of Australian society, because Australia is a society where Aboriginal people largely have a high level of justice. Australia is a society where there's very little racial discrimination. Australia is a society where men and women essentially make the same incomes. Australia is a society that scores extremely well in all these. You would never know it from reading the academic journals. Now, I'm not saying that the academics are bad because they disparage Australia. They're in a way they're people who want to make their society better. Great. But we can't rely on them for data. Right? And in the same way, the people who criticize India, I've been notorious for saying that India's intellectuals as a class are anti-Indian. That's not some kind of insult I'm hurling at them. I don't consider being anti-Indian a bad thing. I'm not Indian.
Yeah.
It's a description of what happens.
Yeah.
It's that the reason we have such an anti-Indian narrative is that India's own intellectuals, of course, what they want is to improve things. They want better conditions for Dalits. They want less social discrimination. They want less patriarchy and more women's rights. They want minorities to be able to worship in peace without feeling threatened. The things they want are good things. But when I have to go for data, not to an impartial census bureau, but to a social crusader, because the only data available are coming from social crusading organizations,
right,
I'm going to get a highly biased view of the country.
Okay, fair point. There's a lot to listen in and observe. You mentioned interesting things like The Wire, for example. It's seen as an anti-government, anti-Modi campaign.
They don't hide that. That's fine. I don't feel, I'm not accusing them of anything that everyone doesn't already know.
Yeah. Fair enough.
But there's a place for that.
Yes.
So when I describe them as anti-government, I'm not criticizing them for being anti-government. Every country needs organizations that hold government to account, that are very aggressive about that. That's not a bad thing, but it is a bias.
Yes.
Right? And so I wouldn't trust The Wire for my data. You know what? But I also wouldn't trust Republic TV for my data either, because they're very jingoistic.
Yeah.
No, who do I trust? Well, I trust someone like India Today or News 18. Who are who make a real effort to be objective. The Indian Express. I read the Indian Express every day. They make an attempt to be objective.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, that obviously. At some point in time, they say you have to take sides. You have to be either left or right. Centrist, being a centrist is not really a thing. It's just a thing on paper. Would you agree to that, or?
Voters have to take sides, but sociologists and political scientists, social scientists should not take sides. I could be flippant and say the only side I take is the truth. But that's not really what we mean by taking sides.
Yeah.
No. Look, academics, journalists should not take sides. But citizens have I won't say a duty to take sides, but it's their right to take sides. Citizens in a democracy present, or parties in a democracy present alternative visions for the country, and citizens decide which side they want to support. That's how democracy works.
Okay, fair enough. We've spoken a lot about, the West, democracy in India, the elections, the Ram Temple. I just want to wind up with a couple of more questions, particularly around doing business in India and red tapeism.
Sure.
It's still a very big problem, isn't it?
I've heard that. I haven't studied it, but I'm aware of it.
Okay. So are you able to make some comments on that? Or?
Look, business people always hate red tape, but red tape is obviously essential for preserving the environment, for preserving workers' rights, for preventing pollution. If I went back to Bhopal in the 1980s and Union Carbide, I would have said I wish there were a lot more red tape.
Yep.
And a lot more restrictions on what they could do, a lot more safety inspections. So obviously, every society needs to reach some kind of compromise between regulation and free market, where the beneficial effects of the free market are maximized, but the destructive effects are minimized.
Okay.
Right. Where is India on that? I suspect India overregulates. I think most people would agree that India overregulates. Of course, we want environmental regulations, but environmental court decisions should be resolved in years, not decades.
Yep.
Okay. We all want workers' rights, but disputes over working conditions should be resolved in months, not years.
Years. Yep.
The government should not be involved in the economy to the extent that the Indian government is. Now, of course, the Indian government was much more involved pre-1991. It's been a slow process of getting the government out of the economy, but there's still far too many government entities, banks, insurance, steel, in the economy. And the big one is the government is still far too involved in agriculture. Now, people might say that and look at the United States. In the United States, the government is deeply involved in every aspect of agriculture. That's true. It's involved everywhere except, production, right, which is left to farmers to produce. In India, okay, the actual production is done by farmers, but when you are more or less constrained to sell to a government board, it's not much. So farming needs serious reform. That will result, if it were done properly, in farmers, many, many small farmers receiving compensation and moving to cities to start other businesses. And of course, both sides of politics object to that. One side romanticizes the farmer. Oh, we've got to keep the small farmer on his or her farm because it's so important. You think, do you want to go work on a half-acre farm? Well, no. Well, then why should this farmer's family want to live on it? We should give that farmer the opportunity to sell his or her farm and move to a regional city and start a small business where it's less work, more secure, easier access to medical care. Everything is better. I mean, the small farms have to go. On the other side of politics, of course, there's not that romanticization of the small farm. Instead, there is the economic protection of small farms and not wanting, for example, the bans on exports of potatoes or peas and things like that.
Yeah.
Which again is a problem. Small farms have to be shut down. Not in the Soviet way, not shut down and collectivized. They need to be shut down in a liberalizing way. They can sell their land and move on.
Yep.
And get a good price for it, and there should be mechanisms to ensure they get a good price for their land, but they have to be able to, they have to get off the land. It's that simple. Keeping people on the land is very romantic. It's a very romantic notion of city dwellers who don't want to live on the land.
Okay.
And that's the big reform because 40% of India still works on the land. And that's got to come down to 5%.
Right.
And there's no way to bring 40% down to 5% without getting people off the land. I mean, the only future path for India's economy is to bring farming down from 40% of the population to 5% of the population. If you won't do that, India will stall out in the 2030s in economic development.
So in essence, what you're saying is privatization is the way to go?
Well, it's already sort of privatized. Farmers work for themselves, but the end of the semi-subsistence farmer is, look, large farms are necessary. The wrong way to do it is the Nehruvian way. Collectivization is not the approach. I mean, he tried it, he failed at it, and okay. Let's say not the Nehruvian way, the Soviet way, the Chinese way. That's absolutely wrong. But the Taiwan way, the Korea way, where in both Taiwan and Korea in the 1950s and 60s, small farmers were able to do what they wanted with their land. Most of them sold it on and moved to cities. Some of them developed cottage industries on their farmland, that is, turned their farmland into small factories.
Yeah.
But one way or another, in both South Korea and in Taiwan, farm reform, which gave the farmer the power to do what he or she wanted with his or her own land, that was the key to the dramatic economic success they had in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. India doesn't have to do this probably until the 2030s. It'd be better if it did it sooner. But if India does not do this, by the 2030s, India's growth will just stall out at a lower middle income level, and won't get anywhere beyond that.
Yeah, that's really interesting fact that you mentioned, because I've personally flown to Singapore at least a dozen times. They don't produce one bit of agriculture. And look at the prosperity of
Well, no. When I say bring the employment down to farming to 5%, India will produce more.
Yeah.
It won't produce less.
Yeah.
The larger farms will be more productive. It's not a matter that it needs capital intensive farming. The same way India now has capital intensive manufacturing, it now has capital intensive service economy.
Yeah.
It needs to have a capital intensive farming.
So the scale matters more than the
Yeah,
volume
the
of
scale
people.
has to rise and the employment has to fall.
Perfect. Sounds good. Last but not the least, I think this might be a bit of a controversial topic, but I'll go and ask it anyway.
Sure.
It's China-US relations.
Yep.
One would argue that it's at its lowest ever.
Well, not ever. I think we were at war in 1950 to 52, but lowest in a long time.
In modern times.
Yes.
Let's put it that way. China's grown into an economic superpower, if you may want to call it. They've got all sorts of ammunitions to defend themselves if they want to.
Sure.
The kind of activities that you see in the South China Sea is extremely disturbing.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they want to take over Taiwan is also very worrying. So how do you see, like, they argue that Russia had some hand in the US elections last year, before that, last time and before that. How do you see China's power affecting the US elections and other things associated with the US economy?
First of all, the Russia hoax is now, I think, being conclusively shown to have been a Russia hoax, and there was no Russian involvement in the 2016 election. I think unequivocally that's the case. Vladimir Putin wanted Trump to win, celebrated when he did.
Yeah.
There was no substantial Russian involvement in the 2016 election in the United States. I think there's tons of evidence around that.
Okay.
Does China want to influence U.S. elections? Sure, it would love to. Is there the theoretical possibility that the Biden family is beholden to China? It's a theoretical possibility. I've seen no real evidence that Joe Biden has conducted his China policy in such ways to avoid some kind of scandal. I don't think there's anything there.
Yeah.
Yes, Hunter Biden benefited financially from relations with China, but I've seen nothing to suggest that has driven China policy in the U.S. So China's effect on U.S. elections is mainly indirect in the sense that both parties in both parties in the United States campaign on anti-China platforms. The Republican anti-China platform being more aggressive than the Democratic Party anti-China platform. Let's keep in mind that Trump's China tariffs, despite the fact that Democrats labeled them xenophobic, et cetera, for the most part, they're all in place under Biden. They haven't been withdrawn.
Yeah.
Okay. So and the U.S. war on Chinese access to semiconductors, that's been tightened. So instead of being loosened it's been tightened down. So if there's one issue on which there's consensus in U.S. politics, it's on countering the challenge from China, and I think the U.S. has been largely successful in doing so. I mean, people might. There are alarmists all over all the time, but the Chinese economy is effectively at a standstill. China is unable to meet its international promises for Belt and Road projects. Yes, there are occasional Chinese wins of small Pacific islands, or arranging a meeting between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but these are really very minor coups in the larger scheme of things.
Yeah.
I don't see any major country voluntarily going over to the China side. You might argue that Russia went over to the China side, but that was not voluntary.
So do you think the US is using India as like a soft power in the region because of Chinese influence? And
there is a fantasy among the US strategic studies community that India is a counterweight to China. That I think is a very immature belief among people who don't realize that India is just going to pursue an Indian foreign policy, not a U.S. foreign policy. Now, India, as long as India and China are themselves experiencing mutual hostility, of course that's welcomed by the United States, but India is not doing it for America, that's for sure.
Okay, that's a strong statement. looks like that hostility is definitely there between India and China.
But it's not provoked by the U.S., it's provoked by China.
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. How much of that the U.S. is using, I don't know. So to make sure that
I think it's very welcome
yeah.
in Washington, but that's really the end of it.
Okay.
There's no practical U.S. involvement
Yeah.
in that conflict.
So I remember during COVID and during the period of pandemic, there was a strong opposition locally here in Australia as well. Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister then, had a strong anti-China policy.
Yeah.
Do you think those policies got carried over to the new Albanese government as well?
No, Anthony Albanese made a very public effort for a rapprochement with China, and quickly realized that China's demands were too extravagant and he could never accept them, with the result that things are right back where they were. Albanese reached out a hand, and China didn't slap it away. China grabbed that hand and tried to pull it along, and Albanese, I think, just let go and said, "Well, I can't do what China wants me to do." So there's, and these are structural facts. That's why I keep coming back to the fact that I'm very much a structuralist. Yes, a Morrison or a Liberal Party government, a Peter Dutton government in Australia would be more rhetorically anti-China than an Albanese government, particularly with our current foreign minister here in Australia. But if you look behind the rhetoric, any Australian government is going to support maritime security,
of course,
in its near waters. Any Australian government is not going to want a Chinese military base in Papua New Guinea. Any Australian government is going to want to buy U.S. nuclear attack submarines.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a faction in the Labour Party led by Penny Wong, the foreign minister, who opposes that deeper relationship with the U.S., but that faction is unsuccessful in having its way with the Labour Party, never mind having its way with the Australian public.
Okay, fair enough. Let's round it up with since you mentioned multiple times foreign policies, India's foreign policies is independent and they take their own decisions. I think a couple of months ago there was a controversy surrounding India and Canada.
Yeah, controversy is a polite way to say it. Yes, yeah.
Controversy is an understatement. But did you think that at any point in time India flexed its foreign policy, or flexed its muscle, or showed this independent policy, or was it all just gimmicks?
I think it was more Canada flexing than India. India really did very little, unless you accept the theory that India assassinated the Sikh leader. Forgive me, I'm not going to remember his name. Unless you believe India actually conducted the assassination, in which case you can say it's flexing its muscles by conducting assassinations. Obviously, that's unknowable. None of us outside a small circle in India's national security administration know what actually happened. But leaving that aside, no, it was Canada attempting to flex its muscles, and Justin Trudeau embarrassing himself, I think, on the global stage because his support from other Western countries was tepid. Other Western countries that are much closer to Canada than they are to India, nonetheless backed up Canada in the weakest possible way. They backed up Canada, the U.S. backed up Canada on that, but in the weakest possible terms.
I wasn't strong enough to say that they are our partners, just like what we have here in Australia. New Zealand are brothers.
Well, there's also tepid support from New Zealand and Australia. Look, very few people realize that when Justin Trudeau went to the Canadian Parliament to make his allegations, that was not a strong statement on his part. That was actually a weak statement on his part. If he wanted to make a strong claim, he would have done it through his Attorney General's office. The fact that he went to Parliament, where he has parliamentary immunity, and all parliamentarians in the Westminster system have parliamentary immunity, means he can say whatever he wants on the floor of Parliament without having to back it up. If he had made a claim via the Attorney General's office, he would have to back that up with facts. Right. So the fact that he did it in Parliament was counterintuitively was him showing. It was him making a political statement that he probably doesn't have the facts to back up, because if he had the facts to back it up, he would have pursued this through the legal
Yep.
framework instead of via political framework. That, of course, he must have known would cause a severe reaction in foreign policy, and it did cause a severe reaction in his foreign relations. And there you go. The similar case in the U.S., where there's been the accusation that India may have attempted to assassinate a Sikh leader in the U.S. All of that has been handled at a government-to-government level, in an appropriate manner with appropriate gravitas. We did not see Joe Biden going to Congress to make a speech about India.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit petty, but yeah, the name I think you're looking for is Niger, who's got apparently Canada accused of executing him, right? But yeah, thank you so much for all your insights, and we spoke everything from all the way from democracy in India to how the elections would affect India, and I do really appreciate your time today, and thank you so much, Professor, for your time.
Great pleasure. Thanks for inviting me in.
Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you again
Sometime soon.
Cheers. Thank you.